Welcome to Games from Folktales, a podcast that mixes historical research and tabletop role-playing settings. I'm your host, Timothy Ferguson. This week, a very early story of a robot uprising. The Wondersmith. Fitzjames O'Brien's monsters are great for Ars Magica, but he was extremely racist. In this story, for example, he goes after Jews, Romani, and Neapolitans, and that's just in the first 4 sentences. That means I can't record his work for LibriVox because they have a policy of not boulderizing the things that are on the site, and I'm not saying those terrible things. So here, just for Games from Folktale listeners, is a story about demonic toy soldiers plotting a robot uprising in 1859, which I've burglarized a heap to take out the racism. Stats eventually, the toys are probably demonically possessed versions of the Ashabti statues we have in Realms of the Nile. I'm doing something else with the demonic eyes for, I want to say, a later episode, but I've recorded them out of sequence, so you may see it before this. Abagor, mentioned later, is a demon lord who can predict the future, particularly with regard to battles and commanders. It's also the name of an Australian black metal band, so when you try and research him, and you're an Australian, Google tries to tell you about 90s music. I heard somewhere that the horse he rides is undead, but it's one of the originals from Eden. That's quite an idea for Ars Magica, because you can resurrect animals with hermetic magic. A fragment of any of the first animals would be all you needed to return them to life, provided they hadn't died of old age. I've cut out a heap of this story. Remember that the narrator is a terrible person going in, though. Few people knew what Her Hip's business or trade really was. That he worked at something was evident. Why else the shop? Some people inclined to the belief that he was an inventor or a mechanician. His workshop was at the rear of the store, and into that sanctuary no one but himself had admission. He arrived in Gollish Street 8 or 10 years ago, and one fine morning the neighbours, taking down their shutters, observed that number 13 had got a tenant. A tall, thin, sallow-faced man stood on a ladder outside the shop entrance, nailing up a large board which said, Her Hip, Wondersmith, painted in black letters on a yellow ground. The little theatre stood in the window, where it has stood ever after, and Her Hip was established. But what was a wondersmith? People asked each other. No one could reply. A bottle full of souls. It was a dull December evening. There was little trade in Gollish Street, and the shutters were up in most of the shops. Hip's store had been closed for at least an hour, and the minor birds and bohemian waxwings at Mr. Pipple's had their heads tucked under their wings in their first sleep. Her Hip sat in his parlour, which was lit by a pleasant wood fire. There were no candles in the room, and the flickering blaze played fantastic tricks on the pale grey walls. On a table close to where Her Hip sat was placed a large square box of some dark wood, while over it was spread a casing of steel so elaborately wrought, in an open arabesque pattern, that it seemed like a shining blue lace, which was slightly stretched over its surface. The profound silence that resigned the chamber was broken by a peculiar scratching at the panel of the door, like that which, at the French court, was formerly substituted for the ordinary knock, when it was necessary to demand admission to the royal apartment. Her Hip stared, raised his head, and then vibrated his long neck like a cobra when it is about to strike, and, after a moment's silence, uttered a strange guttural sound. The door unclosed, and a squat, broad-shouldered woman with large wild eyes entered softly. "Ah, Philomel, you are come," said the Wondersmith, sinking back in his chair. "Where are the rest of them?" "They will be here presently," answered Madame Philomel, sitting herself in an armchair, much too narrow for a person of her proportions, and over the sides of which she bulged like a pudding. "Have you brought the souls?" asked the Wondersmith. "They are here," said the fortune-teller, drawing a large pot-bellied black bottle from under her cloak. "I've had such trouble with them." "Are they of the right brand? Wild, tearing, dark, devilish fellows. We want no essence of milk and honey, you know, none but the soul as bitter as hemlock, or scorching as lightning will suit our purpose." You'll see. They are ethereal demons, every one of them. They are the pick of 1,000 births. Do you think that I, old midwife that I am, don't know the squall of a demon child from that of an angel child, the very moment they're delivered? Ask a musician how he knows, even in the dark, a note struck by Thalberg from one struck by Liszt. "I long to test them," cried the Wondersmith, rubbing his hands joyfully. "I long to see how the little devils will behave when I give them shapes. It will be a proud day for us when we let them loose upon the cursed children. Then once more we will be lords of the earth as we were before the accursed things called cities existed, and men lived in the free woods and hunted the game of the forest. Toys indeed, aye. We'll give the little dears toys, toys that all day will sleep calmly in their boxes, seeming stiff and wooden and without life, but at night, when the souls enter them, will arise and surround the cots of the sleeping children and pierce their hearts with their keen and venomed blades. Toys indeed, oh yes, I will sell them toys." And the Wondersmith laughed horribly, while the snaky moustache on his upper lip writhed as if it had a serpent's power and could sting. "Have you got your first batch, Her Hip?" asked Madame Philamel. "Are they ready?" "Oh, aye, they're ready," answered the Wondersmith with gusto, opening as he spoke the box covered in the blue steel lacework. "Here they are." The box contained a quantity of exquisitely carved wooden mannikins of both sexes, painted with great dexterity so as to present a miniature resemblance of nature. They were in fact nothing more than admirable specimens of those toys which children delight in placing in various positions on the table, in regiments, or sitting at meals, or grouped under the stiff green trees which always accompany them in the boxes in which they are sold at toy shops. The peculiarity, however, about the mannikins of Her Hip was not alone the artistic truth with which the limbs and features were gifted, but the countenance on each little puppet. The carver's art had wrought an expression of wickedness that was appalling. Every tiny face had a special stamp of ferocity. The lips were thin and brimful of malice, and the small black bead-like eyes glittered with a fire of universal hate. There was not one among the mannikins, male or female, that did not hold in his hand a miniature weapon. The little men scowling like demons, clasped with wooden fingers swords as delicate as a housewife's needle. The women, whose countenances expressed treachery and cruelty, clutched infinitesimal daggers, with which they seemed about to take terrible vengeance. "Good," said Madame Philamel, taking one of the mannikins out of the box and examining it attentively. "You work well. These little ones are of the right stamp. They look as if they had mischief in them. Ah, here come our brothers." Reader's note, other men enter. I'm cutting them out because their dress marks them as being of a particular ethnic group, and the men drink together, and there's a long speech about why their people are drunkards. Let's move on. "How does your eye get on, Kerplone?" "Excellently. It is finished. I have it here." And the little Frenchman put his hand into his breeches pocket and pulled out a large artificial human eye. Its great size was the only thing in this eye that would lead anyone to suspect its artificiality. It was twice the size of life, but there was a fearful speculative light in its iris, which seemed to expand and contract like the eye of a living being, that rendered it a horrible staring paradox. It looked like the naked eye of the Cyclops torn from his forehead and still burning with the wrath and desire for vengeance. The little Frenchman laughed pleasantly as he held the eye in his hand and gazed down on the dark pupil. It stared back at him, it seemed, with an air of defiance and mistrust. "It's a devil of an eye," said the little man, wiping the enamelled surface with an old silk pocket-handkerchief. "It reads like a demon. My niece, the unhappy one, has a wretch of a lover, and I have a long time feared she would run away with him. I could not read the correspondence, for she kept her writing-desk closely locked, but yesterday I asked her to keep this eye in a very safe place for me, so she put it, as I knew she would, in her desk, and by its aid I read every one of her letters, and she was to run away next Monday, but she will find herself disappointed." The little man laughed heartily at the success of his stratagem, and polished and fondled the great eye until the optic seemed to grow sore with rubbing. "You've been at work too, Herr Hip, I see. Your mannikins are excellent. But where are the souls?" "In that bottle," answered the Wondersmith, pointing to the pot-bellied black bottle that Madame Philamel had brought with her. "Yes, Monsieur Kerplone," he continued, "my mannikins are well made. I evoked the aid of Abagor, the demon of soldiery, and he inspired me. The little fellows will be famous assassins when they're animated. We'll try them tonight." "Good," cried Kerplone, rubbing his hands joyously. "It's close on New Year's Day. We will fabricate millions of little murderers by New Year's even, and then sell them in large quantities. And when the households are all asleep, and the children are waiting for Santa Claus to come, the small ones will troop from their boxes, and the children will die. It's famous. Health to Abagor." Reader's note, I'm cutting out a romantic subplot here between his daughter and the bookseller, as it offers us nothing but a potential pair of coven folk. The conspirators are worried they'll be seen. "I'll take care we're not disturbed," said Kerplone, rising. "I'll put my eye outside the door to watch." And he went to the door and placed his great eye on the floor with tender care. As he did so, a dark form unseen by him or second vision glided along the passageway noiselessly and was lost in the darkness. "Now for it," exclaimed Madame Philomel, taking up the fat black bottle. "Her Hip, prepare your mannikins." The Wondersmith took the little dolls out one by one and set them on a table. Such an array of vicious countenances was never seen. An army of Italian bravos, seen through the wrong end of a telescope, or a band of prisoners at the galleys in Lilliput, will give a faint idea of the appearance they presented. While Madame Philomel uncorked the black bottle, her hip covered the dolls with a species of linen tent, which she also took from the box. This done, the fortune-teller held the mouth of the bottle to the door of the tent, gathering the loose cloth closely around the glass neck. Immediately tiny noises were heard inside the tent. Madame Philomel removed the bottle, and the Wondersmith lifted the covering which had enveloped his little people. A wonderful transformation had taken place. Wooden and flexible no longer, the crowd of mannikins were in full motion. Their bead-like eyes turned, glittering on all sides. Their thin, wicked lips quivered with bad passions. Their tiny hands sheathed and unsheathed little swords and daggers. Episodes common to life were breaking out in every direction. 2 martial mannikins paid court to a sly-faced female, who smiled on each alternately, but gave her hand to be kissed by a third mannikin, an ugly little scoundrel, who crouched behind her back. There, a pair of friendly dolls walked arm in arm, apparently on the best terms, while at the same time each was watching for his opportunity to stab the other in the back. "I think they'll do," said the Wondersmith, chuckling as he watched the various incidents. "Treacherous, cruel, bloodthirsty, all goes marvellously well. But stay, I'll put a grand test to them." So saying, he drew a gold dollar from his pocket and let it fall on the table in the midst of the throng. It had hardly touched the table when there was a pause on all sides. Every head turned to the dollar, and about 20 of the little creatures rushed toward the coin. One, fleeter than the rest, leapt on it and drew his sword. The entire little crowd of people had now gathered round the new centre of attraction. Men and women struggled and shoved to get near the gold. Hardly the first Lilliputian mounted upon the treasure when 100 blades flashed back a defiant answer to his. A dozen men, sword in hand, leapt on the yellow platform and drove him off at sword's point, and then commenced a general battle. The miniature faces were convulsed with rage and avarice. Each furious doll tried to plunge dagger or sword into his neighbour, and the women seemed possessed by 1,000 devils. "They'll break themselves into atoms," cried Philomel, as she watched their eagerness, their savage melee. "You'd better gather them up, her Hip. I will exhaust the bottle and suck all the souls back from them." "Oh, they're perfect devils. They're magnificent little demons," cried the Frenchman with enthusiasm. "Hip, you are a wonderful man." While Wondersmith and Caplone were talking, the Wondersmith had placed the linen tent over the struggling dolls, and Madame Philomel, who had been performing some mysterious manipulations with her black bottle, put the mouth once more to the door of the tent. In an instant the confused murmur within had ceased. Madame Philomel corked the bottle quickly, the Wondersmith drew the tent, and lo, the furious dolls were once more wooden-jointed and inflexible, and the old sinister look was frozen in their faces. "They must have blood, though," said Her Hip, as he gathered them and put them in his box. "Mr. Pipple, the bird fancier, is asleep. I have a key that opens his door. We'll let them loose among the birds. It will be rare fun." "Magnificent!" cried Caplone. "Let's go on this instant, but let me gather up my eye." The Frenchman pocketed his eye, gave it a polish with the silk handkerchief. Her Hip extinguished the lamp. Wondersmith took the last bumper of port, and the 4 departed to Mr. Pipple's, carrying the box of mannikins with them. Reader's note, let's skip now to the uprising. While Solon the bookseller peeped through the keyhole, all in that room was motionless. He had not gazed for many seconds when the chair of the fortune-teller gave a sudden lurch, and the black bottle, already hanging out of her wide pocket, slipped entirely from its resting place, and falling heavily on the ground, shivered into fragments. Then took place an astonishing spectacle. The myriads of armed dolls that lay in piles about the room suddenly became imbued with motion. They stood up straight, their tiny limbs moved, their black eyes flashed with wicked purpose, their thread-like swords gleamed as they waved them to and fro. The villainous souls imprisoned in the bottle began to work within them. Like the Lilliputians, when they found the giant Gulliver asleep, they scaled in swarms the belly sides of the 4 sleepers. At every step they took, they drove their thin swords and quivering daggers into the flesh of the drunken authors of their being. To stab and kill was their mission, and they stabbed and killed with incredible fury. They clustered on the Wondersmith's sallow cheeks and sinewy throat, piercing every portion with their diminutive blades. Philomel's fat carcass was alive with them. They blackened the spare body of Monsieur Caplone, and they covered Wondersmith's huge form like a cluster of insects. Overcome completely with fumes of wine, the tiny wounds did not for a few moments awaken the sleeping victims, but the swift and deadly poison with which the weapons had been so fiendishly anointed began to work. Her Hip, stung to sudden life, leapt to his feet with a tiny army clinging to his clothes and his hands, always stabbing, stabbing, stabbing for an instant. A look of stupid bewilderment clouded his face, then the horrible truth burst on him. He gave a shriek like that which a horse utters when he finds himself fettered and surrounded by fire, a shriek that curdled the air for miles and miles. "Oaksmith, Kaplon, Philomel, awake, awake, we are lost, the souls have got loose, we are dead, poisoned. Accursed ones, demons, ye are slaying me, are fiends of hell." Aroused by frightful howls, these three also sprang to their feet to find themselves stung to death by the Mannikins. They raved, they shrieked, they swore, they staggered round the chamber, blinded in the eyes by the ever-stabbing weapons, the poison burning in their veins like red-hot lead, their forms swelling and discolouring visibly with every moment. Their howls and attitudes and furious gestures made the scene look like a chamber of hell. Maddened beyond endurance, the Wondersmith, blind and choking with the venom that had congested all his blood vessels, seized dozens of the Mannikins and dashed them into the fire, trampling them down with his feet. "Ye shall die too if I die," he cried with the roar like that of a tiger. "Ye shall burn if I burn. I gave ye life, I give thee death. Down, down, burn, burn. Fiends that ye are to slay us, help me, brothers, before we die, let us have our revenge." Reader's note: the author then implies that the creatures are destroyed when the house burns down. Given their number, that seems unlikely. The whole thing could have taken place long before the player characters become aware that there are a race of tiny assassins living in forgotten spaces along this street. Stats eventually. Your saga may vary.